Black Dahlia. Episode 13. George Hodel. Part 1. Biography. George Hodel is easily the most documented suspect in the Black Dahlia murder due to the efforts of his son, Steve, to prove him as being guilty of the murder of Elizabeth Short, but also many other murders, including accusing him of being the Zodiac Killer. But those are perhaps topics for other videos, so I won't be looking at or commenting on those other allegations here unless mentioning them in connection with the Black Dahlia murder. That said, he is also one of the most controversial suspects largely due to his fictionalized version appearing on television shows that have little basis in fact, such as the TNT series from a couple years back, I Am the Night, which I liked as a work of fiction. To some, such as his son, Steve, George Hodel is a master criminal responsible for perhaps dozens of murders in an ever-lengthening list. Others, like researcher Larry Harnish, see Steve Hodel's case as pure fiction. In the end, truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. And even if George Hodel never murdered Beth or anybody else, there is still enough to show him as a despicable human being. In the end, it will be up to you, the viewer, to believe what you will about George Hodel. Episode 1 will focus on the biographical details of George Hodel. Episode 2 will focus on the theories of him being the Black Dahlia murderer. Episode 3 will go into more detail about the surrealistic aspects of the murder, known as the Exquisite Corpse theory. Whether you agree with him being guilty of the Black Dahlia murder, a long list of other murders, see him as a degenerate, incestuous pervert, or if you think he was cleared of some or all of those allegations, there is no doubt that George Hill Hodel Jr. was a fascinating individual. Shall we begin? There's a rabbit getting anxious to drag you down his hole. George Hill Hodel Jr. was born on October 10, 1907 to parents George Hodel Sr. and Esther. Born of the surname Goldjefter, George Sr., whose father was a wealthy accountant and German scholar, fled Tsarist Russia in 1894 to evade military conscription and anti-Semitism. He settled in Paris, where he met and married Esther Lev, a practicing dentist, and supposed descendant from French aristocrats. The newlyweds immigrated to the United States through Ellis Island on May 31, 1901, and only 25 days later settled in South Pasadena, California. At least in his early years, George Jr. grew up living a seemingly charmed life, attending the famous Montessori school in Paris, and living with the Count and Countess Trubetskoy, almost in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. After a couple years of European education, he went back to California, where he began learning the piano. Piano instructor Vernon Spencer quickly realized his student was a musical prodigy, and the young Hodel performed in concerts and private recitals. In 1921, the Hodels moved into their new home designed by Russian architect Alexander Zelenko, which is now listed as Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument 802, known as the Hodel Residence and Tea House. The main house is located at 6512 Monterey Road, and the tea house at 6511 Short Way. But in George Hodel's childhood, the property was one large lot. The tea house was George's private sanctuary where he could indulge in his studies and hobbies without parental supervision. Young George scored an IQ rating of 186, rating him a point higher than Albert Einstein. His intelligence level helped him race through his school years, graduating from South Pasadena High School at 14, and beginning college at Caltech in 1923 at only 15. Caltech is where Hodel's charmed life faced its first scandal. He was forced out of school after only a year for having an affair and impregnating a faculty member's wife. The child produced from this union would be called Folly. Folly would be the first of George Hodel's children out of 11 born of 5 wives or lovers. Although this episode will mainly focus on George Hodel and the Black Dahlia and will not go into any of Steve Hodel's other accusations against his father, such as the Zodiac murders. Let's take a brief break and go into George Hodel's family tree. Wife or lover number 2 was Amelia Hodel Bergman. Their union would produce child number 2 Duncan. Wife or lover number 3 was Dorothy Anthony Barb. Their union would produce child number 3, Tamar. Tamar would be the mother of grandchild Fauna. Both child, Tamar, and grandchild, Fauna, should be well-known names to those who have already looked into the Hodel theory. Wife or lover number 4 was Dorothy Houston Hodel, who George would nickname Dorero, to differentiate her from the other Dorothy in his life. Dorero comes from the Greek word dor for gift, and the Greek god of sexual desire Eros, which I suppose in Hodel's mind would mean the gift of sexual desire. Their union would produce children numbered 4, Michael, 5, John, 6, Stephen, 7, George Kelvin. Wife or lover number 5 was Hortensia Laguda Hodel Stark. Their union would produce children numbered 8, Teresa, 9, Diane, 10, Ramon, 11 Mark. An alternative reason for expulsion, or perhaps in addition to the affair, was for gambling on campus, which was prohibited. It seems that Hodel now went on a journey of personal exploration, trying out different careers between 1924 and 1928. At 16, he rode along with the LAPD Vice Squad during raids as a crime reporter for the Los Angeles Record, a newspaper published from 1913 to 1926. Here are two examples of his crime journalism. The first details the 1924 murder of Peggy Donovan, who had been kicked to death.
The morning after a party. The splashes of red about the rooms are beginning to change into brown. Lying in the dust of the floor and bestrewn with the fallen ashes and stubs of innumerable cigarettes are scraps of paper, rubbish. There are letters, diaries of forgotten years, prayer books, playing cards. Lying face up on the floor is a card, the ace of diamonds. Over it has fallen a large drop of blood that converts the printed figure of the red diamond to a shapeless and blurred blotch of red. Sheets bloody. Blood-smeared sheets lie crumpled and torn on the littered floor of the bungalow. A pair of dice have fallen from the smashed dressing table. One of the cubes has on it a splashed red stain. Rising above the unmistakable odor of spilled and drying blood are mingling those of liquor, of Jamaica gin, of tobacco. Forgotten advice. Give up every friend that is sinful and learn the truth that makes. Hopeful, pathetically hopeful, words written last December, one day before Christmas, to Margaret Donovan, cabaret girl who was killed in a drunken brawl. Give up every friend that is sinful. Find the truth. I confess to thee, O Lord Jesus Christ, all the sins that I have committed even unto this hour. May the Almighty Lord grant to me pardon, absolution and remission of all my sins. Amen. These words are underlined in a little blue book of Prayers for Daily Use, read this sometime for mother's sake, is inscribed on the title page. A certificate of membership in the National Vaudeville Artists Association, besplattered with blood. Vaudeville bills of 10 years before lie scattered about the rooms. A diary of the year 1918. Listed in it are countless items of vaudeville appearances. Empress Chicago, 2475. Mission, El Paso, 1450. Victoria, Mansfield, 350. Following the last item is written, damn. Aspirin tablets, hundreds of them, lie in little white heaps about the house. Bills, pawn tickets, checks, receipts. Cigar coupons, tied in bundles. Wisps of dark brown hair, long and silken, are strewn about the floor. They are blood-clotted, torn. Torn stockings of sheer silk. Detectives aghast. In the adjoining room detectives are muttering. Good God. Archie, those. Kicked her to death about 3 in the morning and then went and slept till 9. Between the pillow and pillow slip of the overturned cot in which Peggy Donovan was found dead was an age-yellowed newspaper clipping, its sentences underlined. In the garden of life women are the flowers, some are gorgeous, gay and yet have no perfume.
The second article tells of the 1924 murder of Teresa Moores, shot by her jealous lover, boxer Norman "Kid" McCoy Selby.
Words of death. Death. Mors, mortis, morti, glibly the schoolboy declines it. Thoughtlessly. Like a cage in which the canary has been stifled, this apartment on the second floor of the Nottingham, the tall, expensive building with a front of blazing white tiles. While the yellow bird was alive, flitting and singing. The cage seemed a pretty thing. Now with the canary dead it is a dirty cage, tawdry and crusted with birdlime. The canary is dead on the floor of this soft room that seems so close, impinging with walls and ceiling, close like a cage. She lies dead in an unpleasant disarray that is not art but death. And the two buttocks of Larry Darwin, monsters of the new Niobe, bulge with immensity just as the ordered vision of Rubens shrinks into insignificance before the monstrosity on the floor. Larry Darwin's nudes are phantasms, succubi. One smokes a cigarette, perched cross-legged on the devil's head. The other, with stuffed limbs, prances through a garden of exotic lotus flowers. Both leer at the figure on the floor. The figure on the floor. Hair waved and henna'd, perhaps. Redly, dankly, plume for a face disfigured by a bullet hole. Eyes purpled. Blood on the bare white arms. And this photograph, of the kid. Clasped like a rosary to the breast, flat now, and hard, retreated as a woman's breast retreats when she is on her back. The kid placed the photograph in the white hand. A gesture of drama, a futile touch of the romantic school that heightens the grotesquerie, that causes the naked batik succubi to leer the more it seems. Pull it away, the picture. The newspapermen would photograph it, too. Yes, it's a picture of the kid. Blood stains on the glass. The kid stands up young and proud. The clutching fingernails scratch and rattle across the back. Ugh! Put it back in the hand. Let her hold it. On their pedestal the nymph and satyr of pearls have never eased the tension of their eternal embrace. Death. Mors, mortis, morti, what gender is death? Feminine, of course. It is of that declension. Yes, death is feminine.
It wouldn't be long before George decided that he preferred fiction to journalism and decided to publish his own magazine, Fantasia. In years to come such a publication would be called a zine or fanzine. Hodel's fanzine was an exploration of bizarre sexual fantasies. And showed at a young age Hodel's lifelong interest in strange and surrealist art in all its forms. Indeed, such art would become more than just an interest. Some would say it would become his obsession, an obsession that would lead him to practice his art not with the written word, drawings, paintings, sculpture, music, or photography, as other surrealist artists would do, but in murder, using the bisected body of Beth Short as his work of art. Hodel introduced the first issue, January 1925, with this dedication.
A dedication. To the portrayal of bizarre beauty in the arts, to the delineation of the stranger harmonies and the rarer fragrances, do we dedicate this, our magazine. Such beauty we may find in a poem, a sketch, or a medley of colors, in the music of prayer bells in some far-off minaret, or the noises of a city street, in a temple or a brothel or a jail, in prayer or perversity or sin. And ever shall we attempt in our pages the vivid expression of such art, wherever or however we may find it, ever shall we consecrate our magazine to the depiction of beauty anomalous, fantasial.
The first of only 2 published issues contained a review of Ben Hecht's The Kingdom of Evil, a sequel to his Phantasias Mullere, a mysterious oath.
Macabre forms, more dank and putrescently phantasmal than any of Hecht's former imagining, grope blindly and crazedly in the poisonous fog out of which loom the rotting fancies that people his Kingdom of Evil.
Incidentally, as we have seen in the Killer Profiles episode, Ben Hecht would write one of the strangest criminal profiles of the Black Dahlia Killer. After the failure of Fantasia, Hodel's next attempt at work would be as a cab driver by night and a copywriter by day. He next found himself host of a radio show featuring classical music. As well as having a fascination with surrealist art, which would in time find him in friendships with noted artists, Hodel would also find friends in the Hollywood scene. In the mid-1920s Hodel met, who would one day become one of Hollywood's most notable directors and occasional actor, John Huston. This friendship would lead George to two of his wives, and one of them was an ex-wife of Huston, too. Hodel was dating Dorothy, who we will call Dorero from now on to differentiate her from another Dorothy yet to come. John Huston was dating Amelia, who you may remember from the family tree listed earlier. George, Dorero, and John had all known each other and been friends for some time. Amelia was a young librarian working at the downtown Los Angeles Public Library. Hodel and Huston had double-dated in the past, so this was nothing new. Except, for whatever reason, the couples became attracted to their opposite dates. Dorero and Huston soon got married. And Amelia and Hodel started a partnership in more ways than one. As well as starting a relationship, they also opened a bookstore specializing in rare books. I suspect that at the time the young lovers found their opposites shared interests of greater importance at that period in their lives. John was the son of actor Walter Huston, and wanted to carry on with the family's Hollywood tradition. Dorero would become a screenwriter. And at the time, Hodel was pursuing literary aspirations, and Amelia was more into books. Around this time, Hodel explored his interests in photography, even getting a show at a Pasadena art gallery. But I get an impression that Hodel never had the true talent to succeed in any artistic ventures, just enough to get his foot in the door, but never enough to open it. At any rate, his interest in art kept him in a fanboy status as he idolized those he could never join. By the end of the 1920s, the Hodel family had relocated to San Francisco, where George began his medical studies at the University of California at Berkeley. While taking classes, he continued his trend of working diverse jobs, getting back into taxi driving, and even working as a longshoreman. By 1932, George and Amelia started a weekly column for the San Francisco Chronicle titled Abroad in San Francisco. The column featured written and photographic reviews of local events and the diverse cultural community of the San Francisco area. Also around this time, Hodel met the other Dorothy, an affair ensued, and that affair produced a child. But that affair also started a bizarre living arrangement with the new Dorothy. Instead of breaking up the marriage with Amelia, Hodel convinced his wife to allow his new lover to join them in their home. This Dorothy was the mother of Tamar, who will play a large part in the story to come. During his time at San Francisco, Hodel also pursued his medical training. June 1932, Hodel completed pre-med studies at Berkeley. 1932 to 1935, he attended medical school at the University of California, San Francisco. 1936 he completed his internship at San Francisco General Hospital. May 23, 1936, George Hodel received degree of medical doctor after successfully completing 766 hours of surgical practice, assisted with 53 surgeries, and 12 autopsies. His first medical practice was in New Mexico from December 1936 to June 1937 as a camp surgeon for the Civilian Conservation Corps. And around the Gallup, New Mexico area, Hodel served as public health officer for the nearby Indian reservations. His marriage to Amelia ended with her moving back to San Francisco, and Dorothy and daughter Tamar joining him in New Mexico. That, too, quickly faded, and Dorothy and Tamar soon returned to San Francisco as well. George Hodel, too, decided a move was in order. Returning to his roots in California, he accepted a position with the Los Angeles County Health Department in 1938 as a social hygiene physician. This position prompted him to receive further medical training. Returning to San Francisco, he took a postgraduate course in treating venereal diseases, receiving a certification as a specialist in the field. In 1939, he returned to Los Angeles, promoted to Venereal Disease Control Officer for the LA County Health Department. This position prompted him to open the first street medical clinic to combat the growing number of local venereal disease cases. He also opened his private practice. He soon rekindled his romance with Durero, the first Dorothy, who had recently divorced John Huston. And George and Durero married in 1940. Their rapidly growing family moved into a house on Valentine Street in the Elysian Park district. I found on the Architects of Murder website details of Hodel's attempt at military service during World War II and his rejection due to a heart condition. Hodel applied for active duty in both the Army and Navy during World War II, but was rejected on health reasons. In his own words from his later UNRRA application,
"My classification as 4B by selective service was by virtue of the fact that I held, at the time of latest classification, a commission in the reserve of the U.S. Public Health Service. I was commissioned in the rank of PA surgeon. This was in connection with my duties as Chief of the Division of Social Hygiene in the Los Angeles County Health Department. When I resigned the latter, I soon thereafter resigned my commission in the U.S. Public Health Service, in order to apply for a commission in the Army. I notified my local draft board, but have never received a notice of change in classification, although I may have been reclassified. Upon applying for active duty in the Army, I was examined, re-examined, and then asked to sign a waiver, because of history of angina pectoris. This waiver I signed, but was presently informed that because of this condition I could not be accepted for either general or limited duty, even though the condition is not incapacitating. I thereupon applied to the Navy, but was similarly rejected, for the same reason. It was in the spring of 1942 that I passed my physical examination for reserve commission in the U.S. Public Health Service."
Extending his growing list of medical practices, he worked as medical director for the Ruth Home and Hospital in nearby El Monte, California, where he continued specializing the treatment of venereal disease. George and Durero began having marriage problems. She tried to work her way through the failing marriage with the bottle, and her habit deteriorated into a drinking problem that would continue to plague her and her treatment of the children long after the couple separated in September 1944. She filed for divorce, claiming extreme cruelty. 3 times between December 1944 and March 1946, Durero was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct and/or child neglect. On the first 2 incidents, the children were returned to George Hodel's custody, and after the 3rd arrest, the children were sent to McLaren Hall, placed in protective custody, until they could be returned to Durero. On May 9, 1945, Ruth Spaulding, Hodel's 27-year-old former secretary at the First Street Medical Clinic, died from an overdose of barbiturates. The death was officially ruled a suicide, although Steve Hodel suggests that his father killed her. He also alleges that his father and Spaulding had had an affair, and that his motive for murdering her was because she had proof that Hodel was performing and charging for fraudulent medical procedures and prescriptions. And that she also knew something about the alleged connection between Hodel and Beth Short. We will look closer into this in Part 2. On December 3, 1945, George Hodel's application to join UNRRA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, was accepted. And in 1946, he was stationed in Hangzhou, China, at the UNRRA regional office, and given the honorary rank of Lieutenant General. On September 19, 1946, George Hodel resigned his UNRRA commission citing personal reasons. Steve Hodel suggests in Black Dahlia Avenger that his father might have had a heart attack. It could also be possible that he may have been suffering from his angina. Prior to leaving for his service with the UNRRA, George Hodel bought one of the most famous and recognizable homes in Los Angeles, the Soden House, sometimes called the Franklin House for its location on Franklin Avenue. Built in 1926 by Lloyd Wright, son of Frank Lloyd Wright, for John Soden. It was built from textured concrete blocks and designed to look like a Mayan temple. Hodel and Guerrero tried to work out their problems. She and the children moved in the Soden House. And several others moved in as well. As wealthy as Steve Hodel tries to make his father out to be, George Hodel did not have the wealth or power described. Starting around 1948, he rented out rooms to numerous people. Sometimes as many as 10 roomers stayed at the Soden House at the same time. Why would a wealthy man rent out rooms? Maybe Hodel just liked the party atmosphere that more people brought. George Hodel liked to party. I think he liked to live the fantasy life of wealth and power that he dreamed himself living. Celebrities most likely mingled with him at the parties. But how many were there for him, and how many for Guerrero, screenwriter and ex-wife of John Huston? It has already been established that he knew and was friends with John Huston before Huston even married Guerrero. And Hodel's interest in the arts also brought him into contact with noted artists. It is debated how well Hodel knew Man Ray, but regardless of how close their relationship was, they did know each other, and the photographic evidence proves this. Man Ray photographed the whole Hodel family. Man Ray used Guerrero as a model alone and with his wife, Juliet. Man Ray photographed Steve Hodel and his brothers. And Man Ray photographed George Hodel. We will look more into Man Ray and surrealist art in Part 3. Along with Guerrero and the kids from their marriage, George had children from other marriages staying at the Soden House from time to time, most notably for this examination, Tamar, his daughter with Dorothy Anthony Barb. In the summer of 1949, Tamar stayed at the Soden House. Tamar's mother was having problems with the 14-year-old girl, saying that Tamar was
uncontrollable and incorrigible, and it was time for her father to take over.
October 1, 1949, Tamar ran away, forcing Hodel to notify the police. 2 days later, they found Tamar at a friend's house, and Tamar told authorities about George Hodel having sex parties at the Soden House. She also said that she was forced to participate. She then gave details as to being forced to join her father as well as Fred Sexton, Barbara Sherman, and Connie Tarrant in sexual acts. And said her father had been molesting her since she was 11. She also said her father had forced her to have an abortion. George Hodel was arrested, but posted a $5,000 bail on October 6, 1949, and was released. Dr. Francis C. Ballard and his associate, Charles Smith, were arrested for performing the alleged abortion. 13 teenage boys were also implicated with abusing Tamar. To keep things focused on the biography, we will look at the George Hodel incest trial in much greater detail in Part 2. But suffice it to say, after Tamar's mother and other witnesses testified that Tamar was a habitual liar, George Hodel was acquitted of the allegations. In January 1950, police were called to the Hodel residence in response to a possibly suicidal woman. The woman, Lillian Lenarak, had testified in the Hodel incest trial. She was living at the Soden House at the time of the alleged incident and after the trial. Lenarak's mother, a Mrs. Hamilton, asked Santa Barbara authorities to retrieve her daughter and return her. In a strange, almost unbelievable, turn of events, the female officer sent by Santa Barbara police was none other than Mary Unkefer, the same officer who had taken in Beth Short as a temporary ward after her arrest for underage drinking in 1943. This story too will be related in greater detail in Part 2. Another strange incident surrounding the incest trail was that Charles Smith, who had been charged with performing an illegal abortion along with Dr. Ballard, made a bizarre statement as related in a memo to DA's office investigator Lieutenant Frank B. Jemison from investigator Walter Morgan.
Smith said that someday he was going to fix Tamar. He was going to cut a chunk out of the calf of her leg and fry it, and eat it in front of her eyes, and then puke it up in front of her face.
Even though acquitted, DA's office investigators bugged the Soden House for a period of roughly 6 weeks from February through March 1950. Although there were some interesting recordings, investigators believe that Hodel knew the house was bugged, so anything incriminating may have been made up to taunt the investigators. We will look at some of these bugging transcripts in episode 2. After the trial, with his reputation ruined, Hodel moved to Hawaii, where he started a new job as resident psychiatrist for the Territorial Hospital. A Honolulu Star Bulletin August 23, 1952 article said Hodel was chief of the psychiatric clinic at Oahu Prison and is on the lecturing faculty of the University of Hawaii. Even Dr. Deriver of the Dillon fiasco scandal had more psychiatric credentials than George Hodel. Hodel married his newest wife, Hortensia Laguda, in Sonora, Mexico, in August 1952. Hodel maintained his positions in Hawaii until 1954 and he moved to Manila in the Philippines, where he started a private practice in consulting psychiatry. He then completely reinvented himself again, leaving medicine, and starting a new career in market research, creating the firm, International Research Associates, UNRRA Asia, in which he would go on to operate 15 offices. Later in the 1960s he and Hortensia divorced, and he married his last wife, June, in 1969. In 1972 he would again begin a new business, this time in real estate, forming Land Growth International Limited. In 1990, Hodel returned to the United States and settled in San Francisco. He died May 16, 1999 at the age of 91. In episode 2 of the George Hodel theory, we will look at allegations that he murdered Elizabeth Short.